Assalamu alaikum jami'an. It's my pleasure to chair this session. My name is Hassan Ali. I'm a professor of economics at Ohio State University. I also happen to be the chair of the board of trustees of the Economic Research Forum. This is really what ERF is all about. What we are doing is basically creating the data set that is very hard to get. I salute our own Raghi Asad for his effort over the years. Of course, the gratitude is due to all the sponsored participants. And I'm not going to take much time, but I just want to acknowledge that this is what we are trying to do to create an evidence-based kind of helping the policymaker to take decision. Our session today is for the evolution of labor supply and the employment in Egypt. We do have the speakers. Our speakers are Raghi Asad, and let me introduce Raghi formally. He is professor and Freeman Chair of International Economic Policy at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs, University of Minnesota. And he has been a research fellow with the ERF since 1994. We are very fortunate that ERF came to existence under the leadership of our own Heba Handusa, who is happen to be with us. I would like to acknowledge her leadership in this area. Raghi is also a resident research fellow at the ISA, the Institute of Labor Economics in Germany. His current research focus on labor market, human development. I think he is known for all of the people who are working in labor market around the world, not only in the region or in Egypt. I'm gonna give Raghi the...
Carolyn is first.
Carolyn first, okay. Then is Carolyn online?
Yes.
Carolyn?
Yes, I'm online. Can you hear me?
Great. I heard that you are waking up very early in order to be with us. Thank you very much. It's about, what, 6 o'clock in the morning? Or 3 in the morning, my God.
3 in the morning.
Thank you very much. Carolyn is an associate professor also at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs, University of Minnesota. She received her PhD from the Department of Applied Economics at University of Minnesota. Her research examine issue in development economics, labor, education, health, inequality, especially in the Middle East and North Africa. Her current project include work on green jobs, conflict and displacement, gender, labor market, living a minimum wage, social protection, and education equality and inequality. Carolyn, you have 20 minutes, and then we will move on to the discussion. Floor is yours.
Thank you very much for that welcome, and I'm so sorry that I cannot be there in person, and I'm joining remotely, but hopefully all the technologies will cooperate. Let me get this to view. All right. I'm hoping you can see my screen, as I'm going to be talking about the evolution of labor supply in Egypt through 2023. And this is some work I did with Dr. Raghi and also one of my students, Zoe McKillop. So just in terms of the scope of this first presentation, because it complements very nicely the following one as well. So this presentation is going to focus on the labor supply, and particularly talk about the demographic pressures on labor supply, including the population structure and fertility, as well as education trends. And then talk about, as Raghi alluded to in much more detail, some of these different key labor supply rates, labor force participation rates, employment rates, unemployment rates, and then a particular focus on youth participation. So looking at youth not in education, employment, or training, NEET, and youth joblessness, which is those who are not in education, not in employment or training among those not in education. So just in terms of the population structure and how that's been changing over time, this figure is showing the percentage of the population in each age group, looking over all the different waves of the ELMPS. And the darkest line in black is the 2023 pattern. And a really few important patterns emerge that are going to affect labor patterns from this population structure. So at this point, the youth bulge that had been a major pressure on the labor markets for a number of decades is really prime age. There's a peak around age 35 to 39 that was the youth bulge, and now they're quite prime age, no longer youth. But the children of the youth bulge, what we call the echo generation, who are both reflecting the children of the youth bulge and higher fertility that occurred over the preceding decade, are now 5 to 14. And so they're placing pressures on the education system, and within the next decade will be entering the labor market. Now, interestingly, the number of young children, 0 to 4, is in fact shrinking, and we'll find that that's both due to the fact that they are not coming as children of the youth bulge generation so much, but also we're seeing declines in fertility. So that's an interesting and very important, I think, finding of the ELMPS data, building on the Egypt Family Health Survey trend as well. So this figure is looking at the total fertility rate, the TFR, the births per woman, over time using demographic and health surveys, and most recently the 2021 Egypt Family Health Survey, as well as the ELMPSs. And although historically in the 1980s and into the 1990s, there was steady fertility decline, we did have this stall and this fluctuation for a period from 2000, even increases we saw in fertility in the 2012 ELMPS and the 2014 DHS. And then starting with the 2018 ELMPS, we saw fertility coming back down a little to about 3.1 births per woman, where it had been sort of fluctuating around for some time. But with the Egypt Family Health Survey in 2021, we saw a fertility rate of 2.9 births, and the latest ELMPS in 2023, the fertility estimate is 2.2 births per woman. So a substantial recent decline in fertility. Whether this will persist or fluctuate is, of course, an open question, but a very important trend for long-term demographic pressures. We're also seeing continuing expansions in education for the adult population. So this figure is looking at educational attainment by sex for the working age adults, so ages 25 through 64, over 1988, 2006, and 2023. And there's been a lot of progress in expanding education in Egypt. So for example, the share of folks who were illiterate dropped from 55% of the overall population in 1988 to 21% in 2023. And there have been particularly large gains for women, 70% of whom were illiterate in 1988, and then only 27% in 2023. There's now a large share of the population with an intermediate, so that's like an upper secondary, usually a vocational secondary degree. And that went from 11% in 1988 to 36% in 2023. And likewise, the share of university degrees or above has expanded from 9% in 1988 to 23% in 2023. So there's been a lot of expansion in terms of the working age population's education level. Now, looking at, on the younger side, the current potential students, this figure is looking at enrollment rates by sex, location, and year of age for ages 6 to 24, and comparing 1988 and 2023. And we see a pretty substantial increase in school enrollment, as we'd expect over time. And we have near university primary and preparatory enrollments in 2023. And that's a change from 1988, especially in rural areas. And for rural girls, there were some substantial gaps in primary and preparatory enrollment back in 1988 that have since effectively disappeared. We now see high secondary enrollments, especially in urban areas. So those are, you're looking more like past ages 15. Rural areas have seen growth in secondary enrollments over time, but still a little less than universal there. And we see that higher education enrollment, so you're looking now at the 18 and up, are high, especially in urban areas. And there have been large shifts over time, this major expansion in higher education since 1988, in both urban and rural areas, even though the levels at this point are higher still in urban areas. And the gender disparities we saw somewhat historically are largely gone, and women are even slightly more likely to enroll in higher education. So there's been this increase in school enrollment, and gender parity has been achieved in enrollments, but there is a bit of a persistent urban-rural difference in terms of enrollment. Now, we turn to some of the key labor market indicators here, starting with labor force participation. So the labor force here is the employed who work for pay or profit, as well as the unemployed. And for the unemployed, we have two definitions we're going to present here. We're mostly going to focus on the standard definition. In all cases, the unemployed want to work and are available to work, but the standard definition restricts to those engaged in search, so searching in the past 3 months. The broad definition includes the discouraged unemployed. And so what we're seeing in terms of the patterns over time is the decline in labor force participation that we've seen in past waves continues. So in terms of comparisons from sort of the peak for men and women, so the peak we saw in the ELMPS data in 2012 for men was a labor force participation rate of 80% in 2012 for the standard definition, and that's down to 72% in 2023. For women, the peak we saw was in 2006, and that was 27%, and it's fallen to 18% in 2023. So ongoing declines in labor force participation have continued with the 2023 Egypt labor market panel survey. In terms of employment and work rates, so I talked about employment as work for pay or profit on the last slide, but work includes production and processing for your own household purposes, so subsistence gets added to that market work. And of course, there's an issue of unpaid care work as well, but that's going to be covered elsewhere. So here I'm focusing on employment or work that adds subsistence. So employment trends for men, women, and overall parallel the patterns I saw on the previous slide for labor force participation rates. So they have continued to go down. Employment rates were 77% for men at their high in 2012, and they've dropped to 69% in 2023 for men. Employment rates were 22% in 2006 for women, and they've dropped to 15% in 2023. Now, there are not big differences in employment and work rates for men, but women have some appreciable but diminishing differences between employment and work rates because a fair number of them are engaged in subsistence, but not market work. So in 2006, for example, when we had 22% employment rate, the work rate was 43%, almost double. And then in 2023, with a 15% employment rate, we see a 23% work rate, so 1.5 times. So the difference between the two has reduced over time as employment rates have been falling. Now, focusing in a little bit on the patterns of employment, the employment rate here, I'm examining by sex and age, and looking at some of the most recent years, 2012, 2018, and 2023. So we're seeing really employment rates have declined for men at some of those youth ages and into the prime ages. So the dark solid line is the 2023 data. And you'll note that really for both youth and into about the prime ages, even up to age 45, there's decline since 2018, a modest decline since 2018, a larger decline compared to 2012 for men at those ages. For women, we've seen declines sort of across the age spectrum, particularly at prime ages for women. We've seen a little bit of a decline over time in younger ages, but similar around age 25 between 2018 and 2023. And then through those prime ages, we're seeing slightly declined employment rates kind of across the board for those ages for women. So slightly different patterns of where the decline is happening by age when you look at the differences by gender. There are also some differences in terms of employment declines by education. So this figure is looking at those same years, looking at employment rates by sex and education level. And for men, we're really seeing employment declining from 2018 to 2023 at almost every education level except read and write. And so we're seeing appreciably lower across the board pretty much for men. For women, we note first that women's employment rates tend to be low at lower education levels particularly, and they had been higher at intermediate levels, but those have now pretty much converged with lower education levels. And then they were higher at above intermediate and university. And it's been particularly at university that we've seen declines in employment rates for women in 2023. So those drops for university educated women in employment rates are an important story in the differences by gender in education. Now, one of the things we know in terms of important drivers of women's employment is that their employment rates tend to vary across the life cycle quite substantially, with differences when they're single, when they marry, when they have young children, and then as their children get older. So this figure is focusing just on women and looking at their employment rate by marital status and the age of their youngest child for women not enrolled in school. So those who are not in school at the moment, ages 15 to 64 over time. So what we've been seeing over time is for married women with children under age 18, there's an increase in employment as the children get older. For example, from 12% employment rates for those whose youngest is 0 to 2 years old in 2023 to more like 25% for those married women with their youngest age 12 to 17 in 2023. This is both sort of a cohort and a life cycle pattern potentially. And we know that historically single women had higher employment rates, for example, 25% in 2012 and 2018, but their rates fell appreciably to about 18% for single women in 2023. So we're seeing a little bit of a flattening, particularly on the single side of this life cycle pattern, even though it continues to persist. We've seen employment rate declines across all these groups as well. So turning now to unemployment, we're looking at the unemployment rate, and remember that distinction between standard and broad definitions, depending on whether we require search in the standard definition. So we're looking at the unemployment rate as a percentage of the labor force. And the unemployment rate has declined in 2023, but as the previous slides showed, not due to increases in employment. This is more driven by demographic pressures and then non-participation. So the unemployment, the standard definition, dropped from 11.7% in 1998 to like 8.2 to 8.7 in the ELMPS in the 2006 to 2018 period, and then fell further to 6.3% in 2023. Now, that's overall. There's definitely some gender differences in this pattern. Since 2006, the unemployment rate has been around 4 to 5% for men, and there's really no change from 2018 to 2023 for men. The unemployment rate has fallen for women over time from 23.7% in 2012 to 12.8% in 2023. And the broad unemployment rate that includes the discouraged tends to be substantially larger than the standard one for women, which is due to discouraged unemployment. But this is also declining and the gap is declining, which suggests that women may be increasingly giving up entirely on seeking employment and just remaining out of the labor force. So looking at the age pattern of unemployment here by gender, we're looking at unemployment rates, again, as a percentage of the labor force with those two different definitions and comparing 2018 and 2023. So one of the things you'll note is that there's not a big gap between these rates, as we said, for men, but more of a difference for women, both over time and across definitions. So there's a little bit of a shift in the age profile of unemployment from 2018 to 2023, from the younger youth ages to more of a peak at age 25 for men. And for women, we likewise see a peak in unemployment at age 25, but there are much higher unemployment rates overall, and particularly for young women. But we also see both the convergence between the broad and standard definitions and some shift in terms of exactly which ages have the highest unemployment rates to be a little closer to 25 in 2023 than in 2018. So some shifts to young adulthood for male unemployment and the declines
you have three
we see.
more minutes, Caroline. Three more minutes.
Perfect, are especially for marriage-aged women. We see when we look at unemployment by education, there are only small differences in unemployment over time by education for men. You can see really not much going on there. And then we can see unemployment rates declining for women, and particularly falls in unemployment rates for intermediate and less educated women. University education-aided women continue to have high unemployment rates. Turning lastly to this question of NEET, so not in employment, education, or training, and joblessness is being not in employment or training among those not in education, so to take out that education piece. NEET affects more than a third of youth, so we're focusing on ages 15 to 29, and more than half of youth not in education are jobless. Now, NEET has declined a bit over time, from 40% in 2012 to 35% in 2023, but we see rising NEET for men, falling for women, but that's driven by specifically the education piece. When we look at joblessness, taking out that education piece, that has increased from 52% in 2006 to almost 60% in 2023. And we see large increases in joblessness for men and slight increases in joblessness for women. So this is a concerning trend in terms of what's happening with youth. So I think I'll conclude on time, try to summarize all these many storylines that we'll keep building on throughout the next couple of days. So in good news, demographic pressures are currently at a low. The youth bulge has shifted to prime working ages. The echo of the youth bulge is centered around 5 to 14 ages. So they're in school, but they're not yet labor market entrants. They will be within the next decade, placing a lot of pressures on the labor market. And with reduced participation and reduced pressures on labor market entry, we see lower unemployment rates. But these are not necessarily entirely good news because they're driven in part by lower employment and lower search, particularly by women. In terms of very long-term demographic trends, can you hear okay? We have the
are you muted?
No, I'm still on the audio. It might have gone out on your side. On my side, I still have audio. I'm still,
just lost the voice. Now you are back. Go ahead.
Back? Okay. Okay. So in terms of the very long-term demographic trends, we have the recent fertility decline, and to be seen what will happen in the future with that, but an important shift. We see increasing education and the closed gender gap in enrollment. So those are important demographic trends that are going to affect labor supply. And then we see both participation and employment rates falling for both men and women. For men at all education levels, educated women particularly are having those drops. But unemployment rates are also falling. And that's because of both the changing participation behavior and reduced demographic pressures, potentially women giving up entirely. We also see NEET and joblessness rising, so those youth employment trends are not as promising, and especially doing so for men. So those are some of the important labor supply side themes that I'm happy to discuss more in questions, or we'll see develop in some of the other presentations later today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're going to go ahead with the second presenter, Professor Raghi. I do understand that the paper has other co-author. I'm going to ask Raghi to introduce the other co-author in the paper. And you have also 20 minutes, Raghi.
Right. So here I am back again. So this paper is co-authored with Isra Mahmoud, who is my PhD student currently in Minnesota. and she would have liked to be here, but she's probably 3 o'clock in the morning. I don't know if she's listening. So we've heard about labor supply side, the demographic side, the way education is proceeding. And now I'm going to talk about the focus on employment, talk about the structure of employment and the quality of employment over time from 2012 to 2023. And I'm going to start with the bottom line, what we found in terms of conclusions. And despite a lot of bad news we've heard about labor force participation and employment rates, there are actually improvements in the employment situation since 2018 in terms of growth rates of employment, in terms of private formal wage employment growing. There is less precarious employment among those who are employed and improved access to benefits as formal wage employment has grown. And self-employment is growing very rapidly, much more rapidly than overall employment. Now, finally, we also have we ask about job satisfactions, people's own subjective view of their employment, and this seems to be increased job satisfaction. So this may seem a bit surprising given all the bad news we've heard, but this is, in fact, what the findings show. Now, a lot of these improvements, I'm going to show you the data, but they seem to be the result of a shifting in the structure of employment away from sectors that provide temporary casual employment, what we call informal employment outside establishments, like construction and transportation, for example, towards what I refer to as the re-emergence of the missing middle of the Egyptian economy. Small and medium enterprises are growing faster than overall employment, and they are more likely to provide better jobs, formal jobs. And so that shift is perceived in the data in the results that I just discussed. However, there is never all good news. There is always a dark side, and in this case is what's happening to women's employment. And women's employment situation has deteriorated both in terms of quantity and quality. So the reductions and the discouragement we heard about earlier is in response to pretty negative trends in the labor market for women. So there is, of course, the decline in the public sector has continued unabated, and it affects women much more than men, because women, especially educated women and older women, married women, are much more reliant on public sector employment than men are. And so when the public sector declines, it affects women much more. Now, but the other piece is the private sector wage employment for women has in fact declined. So it has not made up for public sector decline, and has also declined. So there is increase in self-employment among women, but not as much as among men. Now, the evidence also indicates that the formalization of private sector employment, which we are observing in this past period between 2018 and 2023, seems to be limited to more educated and more affluent men. So the formalization has not trickled down to less educated and poorer men. But even though these less educated and poorer men have benefited from less precarious employment. So I'm just quickly going to go over some macro trends and how they relate to employment and unemployment. And then I'm going to talk about the evolution of the structure and quantity of employment, quantitative measures of employment, and then the evolution of the quality of employment. Now, I will not be discussing earnings and wages in this paper, since these are the subject of a paper to be presented after the coffee break. So this is the solid line in the middle is GDP growth. And we can see there was a lot of fluctuations in GDP growth in the case of Egypt, with, of course, this big decline right after 2010, before and after 2010, during the time of the revolution and before that. And since then, the employment rate has declined quite for a long time, from a maximum of 47%. This is based on labor force survey data, down to a minimum of 40% in 2020, and then a slight recovery in labor force data to 42%. But as far as the ELMPS, the little stars on top, you see that the employment rate has continued its slow declining trend, but the decline has slowed down, at least in the employment rate. The unemployment rate, according to both surveys, is going down, as we saw before, but it seems that both unemployment and employment don't seem to be reacting to the macroeconomic trends very much. They are following much more long-term trends. Now, I want to focus more on the structure of employment. What's happening to the structure of employment? And here we're going to redefine the structure by first the formality and the institutional sector in which workers are hired. So I want to go through those. Of course, the public sector includes the government and the state-owned enterprises. The formal private wage employment, people working for wages in the private sector, but also benefit from coverage of social insurance. Informal wage employment is divided into two groups: inside establishments, which tends to be more stable, and outside establishments, which tends to be much more precarious. And then employer, self-employed, and unpaid family work, these are the non-wage workers. So as you can see, the public sector employment has been dropping significantly, from 30% in 2012 all the way down to 21% of employment in 2023. That's a major decline from about 1/3 to about 1/5 of employment. And of course, you can see that women are much more affected, because they were 51% of employed women were employed in the public sector in 2012, down to 38% in 2023. So public sector employment decline has continued unabated, and that, of course, puts pressure on formal employment in Egypt. Now, the good news, however, is that formal private wage employment was declining in share from 2012 to 2018, and now is back up from 9% to 11%. So that's really probably the best news we have today. And you can see that comes at the expense of informal private employment, especially informal private employment outside establishments, which is a very precarious form of employment. And you can see that self-employment has also gone up substantially, from 11% to 18% of total employment. So these are pretty big structural shifts. Now we're going to look at them from the point of view of growth. So overall employment growth accelerated from 1.1% per year to 1.5% per year. And though the employment rate is dropping, overall employment rate, growth rate, has accelerated. You can see that public sector employment is a negative growth, contraction. Formal private employment was contracting in the previous period, and now it's growing at 4.4% per year, which is significantly faster than overall employment. So that's the good news that we saw in the previous. And you can see that informal employment outside establishment is declining at a rate of negative 1.4% per year. That's again good news. These are very precarious kind of jobs, and they are not growing as fast as they were growing in the previous period. Now, self-employment is the big news here as well. It's increased its growth from 2.5% per annum to 11.8% per annum. So self-employment is a big story, and we will have another paper later on really delving into the household enterprises and the micro and small enterprises that are growing, to see what the origins of the self-employment is. But as a maybe preview of that, there's been a lot of growth in self-employment in the education sector. A lot of private lessons. People are hiring teachers for private lessons, both among men and women. Now, the story for women is quite different. And as you can see, the employment rate, the employment growth rate, declined from 1.4% per annum in the previous period, 2012 to 2018, to negative 0.5% per annum. So women are experiencing negative growth in employment as compared to men. And you can see that that, of course, is true in the public sector, but it's also true in the formal private employment. Formal private employment has gone from 5.2% growth for women to negative 2.3%. So again, good story. The good news for men is reversed for women with a decline in formal private employment. And you can see that there is very slow growth of other forms of wage employment for women. The only bright spot for women is self-employment has accelerated from 4.7% per annum to 7% per annum. But this is the only bright spot here. Now, in terms of wealth and education differentials, the paper includes comparisons of the structure of employment by wealth and by education. And this is the point where men in the top 3 quintiles of wealth have seen an increase in formal private wage employment, whereas men in the bottom 2 quintiles have not. And then men with post-secondary and university education, and only women with university education have increased in their share of formal private employment. Now, what about the industry structure of employment by economic activity? And this is the kind of the structural change in the economy. Now, of course, we have a continued decline of agriculture as a share of employment. And that's something we expect as productivity in agriculture increases. That's we expect. The good news here is that we lump mining and manufacturing together, and those two together have recovered to some extent in their share of employment. So mining and manufacturing have increased slightly their share of employment, and that's generally at the expense of construction. Construction, which was booming in the previous period, has a reduced share of employment, and that's where this reduction in the share of informal employment outside of establishment is coming from. Now, we also have growing share of employment in services such as health, social care, professional, financial, and administrative services, and transportation and storage. So these are growing sectors, but again, education as a sector is declining because it's mostly public sector, and it's being brought down by the contraction of public sector employment together with public administration. So this is what's happening. But I think the interesting story is what's happening within private wage employment. Private wage employment, as we know, overall includes formal and informal employment. Overall, it's not growing. It actually contracted very slightly by negative 0.2% per annum. So wage employment in the private sector is not growing as a whole, but there is a shift. The shift we saw earlier from informal to formal, but also there is a shift across the size distribution of firms. You can see that employment outside of establishments is declining by 1.9% per annum, which is good news, that this is the most precarious form of employment. But where are the growth rates? The growth rates are starting with 10 to 24, 2.3% per annum, 25 to 29, 8.7% per annum, 50 to 99, 6.9% per annum. So this is the re-emergence of the missing middle, where medium enterprises in particular, 25 to 99 workers, seem to be growing much faster than either micro or small or large, or for that matter, employment outside of establishment. This is really clear evidence of that emergence of the missing middle. What about the intensive margin in terms of how many hours of work are people working? And we can see here that, in fact, the proportion of people working less than 35 hours a week is declining. But the proportion of those working more than 49 hours per week is increasing. This is what the ILO refers to as excessive work hours. And there are clear increases in the number of work hours. Partly people are trying to make up for, whenever they have the flexibility, make up for lower earnings due to inflationary pressure by working more time. And you can see that especially in the informal wage employment and in self-employment. But also in private formal wage employment, there's an increase in those working more than 49 hours. So now I'm going to focus on one of my favorite indicators of the labor market, which I call time-related underemployment. And this is the proportion of people who are working fewer than 35 hours per week involuntarily because they're not able to find enough work. Now, the reason it's one of my favorite is because unemployment rate, we know, affects mostly the educated who are not working at all and searching for jobs. The poor and the less educated and the more precariously employed cannot afford to do that. So they just try to search for work, and sometimes they don't find it. And the good news here is that time-related underemployment has declined quite substantially, with its peak in 7% in 2012, going down to 2% in 2023. And you can see that that's mostly concentrated among private informal wage worker outside establishments, that very precarious group of workers that I mentioned before. Now, that is good news because, as you can see from this graph, this kind of time-related underemployment affects much more the poor. The lowest quintile of the distribution is much more likely to be in this time-related underemployment, and therefore they are the group that is affected, and the decline in that from 12% in 2012 to 6% in 2023 is really an indicator that labor market conditions are somewhat improving for the poorest through the fact that they're less likely to be in underemployment.
3 more minutes.
Sure. So let me talk about the quality of employment. Here I have a number of measures. We have a measure called irregularity, which is when you're employed either intermittently or seasonally, as opposed to permanently or in temporary employment. And irregularity of employment has gone down very slightly overall, but you can see that, again, it is irregularity of employment is concentrated among this group of informal private wage workers outside of establishments. And just the fact that this group is smaller is contributing to the decline in irregularity. Next indicator of quality that I'm going to discuss is social insurance coverage. And here, overall, we see that social insurance coverage is declining somewhat, but the decline has slowed significantly since the 2012-2018 period. And if you look at private wage employment in particular, social insurance coverage has gone up for that group, which is showing that at least potentially the new law, social insurance law that was passed in 2019, could be having some effect in the private formal wage employment, although it's still dropping to some extent among employers and other groups. So, the story is relatively good news in terms of social insurance coverage, and I think we need a lot more work to attribute this decline, this improvement in social insurance coverage in the private sector to the law. The next is employer-provided health insurance, which is also associated with better jobs, formal jobs. And here I focus on, of course, private wage employment, which is where an employer can provide health insurance. And we can see that there is a slight increase in employer-provided health insurance. And primarily, we see that the increase is concentrated among medium firms and small firms from 10 to 99 workers. And that's a sign of that not only is their weight in the economy increasing, but they're also providing better jobs over time. And then I want to just talk to you about job satisfaction. We ask workers whether they're satisfied or not with their jobs on a scale. I took those who are saying fully satisfied, and there are 45% of workers, believe it or not, who said they are fully satisfied with their job in 2023. And overall, this has increased by 8 percentage points since 2018. So people are more satisfied with their jobs, and you can see that in particular among self-employed and workers, there's a increase in job satisfaction. The only group that is negative change in their job satisfaction overall is in the public sector, but they had the highest job satisfaction to start with. So it's not surprising that it hasn't increased. So to conclude, There are many signs pointing to improving labor market conditions. I mentioned them in detail: accelerating employment growth rates, formal private wage employment is growing faster than overall employment. There is a decline in the most vulnerable and precarious forms of employment. The missing middle is providing more jobs. There's growing small and medium enterprise employment. There's a rapid growth of own account work, and I'm hoping to see evidence that this is actually productive and remunerative own account work. And there is reduced time-related underemployment, which is a sign of less precarity, but an increase in excessive work hours. So most of the job quality indicators are either stable or improving slightly, and there is increased job satisfaction. But again, we have to focus on the fact that there is a very important group who is being left out from this improvement, women in particular, and that is because the public sector employment has been declining and private sector has not been making up for that decline, especially for married and educated women. So we saw earlier the big decline in participation happened for educated women, university educated women in particular. That's a group that's highly reliant on public sector employment, and they are simply not willing to accept employment at the conditions that are currently available in the private sector, and we saw a big decrease in employment there. And all of the other indicators for women are actually looking quite a bit worse than for men. So I will stop here, and hopefully you can hear from the discussants. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Raghi. It seems like maybe the result was leaked because we have dominated by women attending this session here. Well, it's a very well presented result. I think we're going to go directly to the lead commentator. Roland Certain is going to comment on Carolina paper. Let me just introduce Roland. He is the employment specialist at the International Labour Organization for Decent Work Team for North Africa, and he is based in Cairo. So I assume you tasted the kushari yet?
Yes, many times.
Oh, okay. Well, he has been involved with the decent work. That's why I always admire people from the ILO, because they really focus on the good things here. He has extensive work experience with the UN system. He's been also working in other countries like Algeria, Chad, Burundi, and China. Roland is a graduate of the Brussels School of Economics, also one of my favorite. I'm going to give you 10 minutes, Roland, and the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much for your introduction, and I'm very glad to be here and would like first to congratulate CAPMAS and ERF for the tremendous research, data collection and analysis efforts done. A lot of topics have been covered touching labor market, and it's a wealth of data that I know can be exploited especially for policy formulation, policy design, and trying to find now how do we address these gaps that we have identified here. I'll start commenting. I mean, my comments will be a few considerations. First consideration is that the labor market is actually, employment issues are very complex. And as the study described, it can be resumed to unemployment rate. It goes far beyond the unemployment rate, and other indicators needs to be produced to understand more and more the complexities of the labor market we live in. We spoke about the need rate, for example, and I'm going to come back to this one, which now presents itself as an incorrigible, as absolutely needed indicator to follow, as it captures discouragement and inactivity that has been identified as a key issue here. But also working poverty, the quality of work, and how qualitative the work is today. Productivity, is the work productive enough? Informality, we mentioned, underemployment, inactivity, and non-standard forms of employment are taking more and more time of the discussions on labor market debates, and they need their own time for and resources to be analyzed as well. So I'm very glad that this study covered most of these aspects. Let me start by one of the main results here that was highlighted in the first study, that unemployment rate actually decreased as it was observed, but did not translate in better, unfortunately, in better labor market outcomes for both men and women, independently of the educational level, age, and geographical areas. The study mentioned it was due to demographics with current lower pressure on the young entrants in the labor market, but also on these discouragements that can be analyzed through these needs rates that we saw still are at a very high level for men and women. These needs rates can actually capture discouragement, but in different ways. And this was interesting that this study actually differentiates between the people who are actually actively looking for a job, but also the ones not looking but still voluntarily wanting for jobs, and the one declaring not even wanting to go for a job and therefore being in the inactive situations. Regarding the demographic pressure that we saw was lower and adding less pressure on the unemployment rates. Well, the study demonstrates that we are to expect much higher pressure on the labor market entrance with this echo generation, or the children of this huge bulge of the 80s that is expecting to enter the labor market and add additional pressure. And this trend is actually quite the opposite as we see globally. I mean, according to the recent Global Employment Trends for Youth 2024 published by the ILO, only 3 regions in the world will see their youth labor force increase by 2050. The rest of the world will actually see less pressure and less youth labor force, but three regions will see them increase: North Africa by 3.3 million by 2050, the Arab states by 2.4, and most importantly, Sub-Saharan Africa with an increase of 72 million young entrants expected to come in the labor market by 2050. This will certainly add pressure also on labor migration. Now, the study presented declining participation and employment rates, with very detailed analysis between the different years and the different rates of the panel survey. Concern is with, of course, as mentioned, a decline in female participation, and the one especially accelerated among university-educated women, with a decline of participation from 44% in 2018 to 29% in 2023. And that is clearly a missed opportunity for the Egyptian economy to use its investment in human capital, as less university graduates actively participate in the labor market, especially for young women. So that calls for to look into this gender paradox, looking into gender policies. And to me, most importantly, that these declines observed from one year to another is that actually labor force participation and employment rates are actually stay low in absolute terms as well. So less than half of the working population is active at 45%, with still huge gender gaps, and one of the lowest women participation in the world at 18%. So besides these decrease in participation from one year to another, we're still struggling with difficult and structural deficiencies in the labor market due to gender barriers, but also to a lack of high-skilled and productive job opportunities, meeting the expectations of a growing educated population of young coming out of the universities. We have seen through the second study that a third of all workers report being overqualified for their jobs in 2023, which is up to an increase of 27% compared to 2012, and a much smaller portion being underqualified. So the overqualification of the workforce, and especially of the young people, is concerning, and therefore these structural deficiencies. Therefore, then the question of, okay, about the policies and the necessary policies to put in place, that according to the ILO should go beyond the traditional supply-side policies that aim to train the workforce or help the workforce transitioning. In a joint ERF-ILO policy note that was published last year in May 23, called Toward More Job-Rich Growth Policy, the author concluded that deeper and more structural reforms are needed in order to enable the Egyptian economy to create more and better jobs. And there were two main recommendations that I think I would like to recall that go beyond the supply side, but I think address the key indicators that were mentioned in the study on employment and unemployment. Like, first of all, reforms must be directed towards labor-intensive sectors to create more jobs. Sectors that can stimulate the economy, and here we speak about digital, green, care economy, especially that the elderly population share you demonstrated is growing much faster this year than it was the last year, calling for care economy and care responses. And then, yeah, I nearly finished. And then ensuring the enabling environment for sustainable enterprise development, facilitating access to finance, competition, land, energy. So demand-side policies go hand in hand with supply-side ones, and this is what the ILO understands as part of integrated employment policies. And lastly, I would like just to finish by one comment. I'm very glad that you addressed in Raghi, in your second paper, this dimension of quality, the quality of work, and you identify certain criteria. You mentioned job satisfaction and access to paid and social insurance. I would also add an important one, which is the compliance to fundamental principles and rights at work. Rights at work that are reflected in the labor law and that follow also the international labor conventions, speaking about other important aspects like violence and harassment at the workplace, because we know these are important criteria for women to transition, equal remuneration, and also social dialogue and the rights freedom of association, and the rights to organize for employers to raise and be able to express their voice. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Roland, very much. Thank you very much, Roland. We'll move directly to the second discussant, Dr. Shaimaa Mahgoub. She is the head of the Supporting Labor Market Policy at the Federation of Egyptian Industry, and she will discuss the second paper by Dr. Raghi. Dr. Shaimaa has a history of working in planning and sustainable development in the Ministry of Planning before. You have also 10 minutes, Dr. Shaimaa.
Firstly, I'd like to thank ERF for inviting me to be a part of this panel. It provides me with another opportunity for learning from Professor Dr. Raghi. I was honored to be a technical and administrative coordinator for Studies Census Project on behalf of the Ministry of Planning and Economic Development, which was very prominent studies. Dr. Hussein Abdelaziz and Dr. Raghi Asad are two crucial papers for them. Allowed me to present my, I prefer to present my presentation in Arabic. Paper M مش هكرر هو examine evolution of employment in Egypt over 2012 to 2030 by examining employment growth, structure of employment underutilization, and employment quality. المين مسج او البانش لاين الدكتور راجي اتكلم فيه هو improvement in employment outcomes. Improvement is partially associated with employment status and employment structure, and it's limited only to male more than female. My comments will be focused on four main points: employment rate and the GDP growth, employment structure and job and current dynamism in the labor market, employment structure and job quality, and finally the women. Employment and GDP growth, the paper revealed that the unemployment rate have been weakly responsive to growth, أو إن معدل التوظيف غير يعني not responsive لمعدل النمو الاقتصادي، وده ظاهرة مش جديدة عندنا في الاقتصاد المصري. ده ترند من فترة طويلة، إنه النمو غير داعم للوظائف. السؤال هنا: how can the economy generate more jobs while boosting the economic growth? السؤال هنا ازاي ان الاقتصاد يقدر يولد more jobs while boosting the economic growth, taking into consideration the declining share in the public sector employment. لو جينا نتكلم عن الاسباب الاساسيه للاقتصاد بيولد ما بيولدش الوظائف الملائمه، او في ديسلينكينج ما بين الامبلويمنت ريت وما بين الايكونوميك جروث، هل ده راجع للنيتشر اوف الايكونوميك جروث؟ هل ده راجع للنيتشر اوف ايكونوميك ستراكشر او البيزنس انفايرمنت؟ الحقيقه انا ربطت ده ببرنامج عمل الحكومه والاليات المطلوبه لتحقيق الاهداف اللي برنامج عمل الحكومه بيهدف ليها. السكند بيلر للبرنامج بيركز على increasing the job opportunities و reducing unemployment rate. الثيرد بيلر بيركز على البرايفت سيكتور، enhancing the presence of private sector وزياده الشير ليه في الجي دي بي في الاستثمارات الاجماليه من 60 ل 65% بلس الاف دي اي ريتش ل 14% باي 2030. لو جينا نبص على الريل جي دي بي جروث درايفرز هنلاقي انه المين درايفرز للايكونوميك جروث من ناحيه الانفاق هو الفاينل كونسومشن، وبالتالي لو احنا بنتكلم على هدف يخص النمو الاقتصادي فقط فاتس اوكي انه يبقى معدل النمو الاقتصادي بهذا الشكل، لكن لو احنا بنتكلم على نمو اقتصادي داعم للوظائف يبقى لازم انه الانفستمنت شير والنت اكسبورتس شير يزيد على حساب الفاينل كونسومشن اللي هو مينلي برايفت كونسومشن. دي النقطه الاولى. النقطه الثانيه لو جينا نبص على مثلا البابليك فيرسس برايفت سيكتور انديكيتورز، المساهمه في الجي دي بي، الانفستمنت، الامبلويمنت او الكريدت، هنلاقي بالنسبه للبرايفت سيكتور 70.9% الشير للجي دي بي في آخر سنة، 29 مقابل 29.1% للبابليك سيكتور. وبالتالي المحرك الأساسي للنمو الاقتصادي هو البرايفت سيكتور. اما نيجي نبص للامبلويمنت 81.3% في مقابل 18.7% وفقا لبيانات البنك المركزي البابليك فيرسس البرايفت. والديكلايننج شير للبابليك سيكتور زي ما احنا شايفينه، زي ما الدراسه طبعا اكدت الديكلايننج شير للامبلويمنت في البابليك سيكتور. طب النقطة دي مهمة قوي، هل هذه المؤشرات تتماشى مع استحواذ الاستثمارات العامة والخاصة؟ هنلاقي ان في يعني الاستثمار العام بيستحوذ على 74.2% في مقابل 25.5% بالنسبة للبرايفت سيكتور. وطبعا ده لا يتماشى ابدا مع دور القطاع الخاص في توليد النمو وتوليد الوظائف زي ما السلايد شرحت. النسب دي بتتماشى تماما مع الكريدت الممنوح للجفرمنت والبرايفت سيكتور. هنلاقي انه 70.5 في اخر سنه في مقابل 20.2. كمان الاتجاه في اتجاه للتزايد من 2010 واتجاه للتناقص برضو من 2010 بالنسبه للبرايفت سيكتور سبيشالي في الفتره الاخيره. وبالتالي ان احنا عشان نحقق السكند بيلر والثيرد بيلر من الجفرمنت بروجرام، ايه الاليات والبوليسيز المطلوبه لده؟ الالتزام بوثيقه ملكيه الدوله مهم، بروموتنج للبزنس انفايرمنت مهم، الاف دي اي استراتيجي في منتهى الاهميه. ولكن البزنس انفايرمنت لو يعني جذبت القطاع الخاص في الاستثمارات، بالتالي القطاع الخاص المحلي هيتجذب القطاع الخاص الاجنبي. في نقطة أحب هايلايت عليها هنا، الريفورمز أجندة في الفيدريشن اوف ايجيبشن اندستريز. طبعا الفيدريشن هو يعتبر من أكبر أو إن ما كانش الأكبر من ممثلي القطاع الخاص في الايجيبشن ايكونومي. 105 ألف منشأة و more than 2 million workers. كل ده بيستدعي ان احنا بنشوف المشكلات اللي بتقابل المصنعين وبيتم بلورتها في نقاط محددة، ومقابل ده بيتم صياغة الحلول المقترحة لده. وبالتالي إذا كان النمو غير داعم للوظائف، عشان النمو يكون داعم للوظائف لازم الشير بتاع البرايفت سيكتور يزيد، لازم البيزنس انفايرمنت تتحسن علشان تاتراكت الانفستمنت للبرايفت سيكتور. النقطة الثانية هي الامبلويمنت ستراكشر. الورقة ذكرت انه الديكلايننج وركرز في الكونستراكشن with a slight increase in the manufacturing. طيب انا هبتدي من النقطة اللي دكتور راجي ذكرها في الدراسة السابقة اللي كانت معمولة في وزارة التخطيط، اللي هو دي اندسترياليزيشن في الايجيبشن ايكونومي. المانيفاكتشرنج كونتريبيوشن للجوب جروث قل من 96 ل 17 32 21. كمان قل في الجوب كرييشن مقارنه بالفتره 96 ل 2006 للفتره 2006 2017. كمان الاي ال او اكدت ده بالدراسات بتاعتها وغيرها من الدراسات والادبيات التنمويه. طيب ده الكرونيك بروبلم عندنا في الاقتصاد المصري. ايه اللي حصل السنه دي؟ اللي حصل انه ان الكونستراكشن السنه دي الاي ال ام بي اس قال انه خلال الفتره الاخيره من 18 ل 23 ابتدى الكونستراكشن الشير اوف كونستراكشن امبلويمنت contracted from 18 ل 23 after having a potential increase في مقابل الاوبزيت ترند بالنسبه للمانيفاكتشرنج. ودي طبعا جود ساين انه احنا نبني عليها لان دي دايناميزم حصلت في الليبر ماركت. ده طبعا ماشي مع مساهمه القطاعات المعنيه اللي انا ذكرتها دلوقتي في الجي دي بي والانفستمنت والامبلويمنت اللي موجوده دلوقتي. لو احنا شفنا الانفستمنت في ديكلايننج ترند بالنسبه للمانيفاكتشرنج في مقابل رايزنج ترند بالنسبه للكونستراكشن والبيلدينج، هكذا بالنسبه للجي دي بي. يعني احنا عندنا دلوقتي المانيفاكتشرنج سيكتور في الجي دي بي نزلت ل 12.4%. طبعا دي نسبه قليله جدا على انه يليد عمليه التنميه او النمو زي ما برنامج الحكومه المصريه ذاكر الفتره دي، لانه الادبيات التنمويه كلها بتقول انه لما القطاع لو انا عايز اعمل الديزايرد ايكونوميك ستراكشر بقياده الصناعه التحويليه لازم الشير بتاعها يبقى من 25 ل 30. احنا 12.4%، فده محتاج طبعا efforts كتيره تحصل علشان ده. ولكن يمكن البناء على البيانات الحاليه من المسح و تأهيل العمالة اللي موجودة دلوقتي، وبحيث ان هي تبقى المين سكيلد ليبر والانبوت للمانيفاكتشرنج سيكتور. الجفرمنت بروجرام بيقول انه انكريز الشير في المانيفاكتشرنج في الجي دي بي، كمان الاكسبورتس ل 15% سنوي. السكند بيلر بيقول انه كواليتي اوف اديوكيشن، كل ده محتاج ان احنا نركز على البيزنس انفايرمنت، بنركز على الامبلويبيليتي والديماند دريفن اديوكيشن اند تريننج، وده بيتطلب طبعا الاكتيف ليبر ماركت بوليسيز والتكنيكال اند فوكيشنال اديوكيشن اند تريننج. من المهم قوي، بس انا هقف عند النقطه بتاعه الخاصه بالسات اللي هو سكولز ابلايد تكنولوجي اند الناشونال كواليفيكيشن فريم ورك. النقطة الخاصة بالسكول ابلايد تكنولوجي دي مهمة قوي، لأنه أحيانا بيبقى في تخصصات من العمالة موجودة في الهاير اديوكيشن ليفل ومش موجودة في السكندري اديوكيشن أو التعليم الفني، زي مثلا التخصص الخاص بالصيدلة أو الأدوية، ده مش موجود في التعليم. وبالتالي القطاع الخاص عشان هو محتاج العمالة الفنية في الشريحة دي من الفنيين مش العالية، فعمل مدرسة خاصة بالصيدلة للعمالة الفنية اللي تبقى انبوت للصناعة في الجزئية دي. وهكذا من المدارس الكتيرة اللي اتعملت في قطاعات كتيرة زي المحلة الكبرى غزل ونسيج، وفي ميكاترونكس، و يعني اكتر من مدرسه. الفكره هنا انه المشكله انه مفيش مأسسه لاتساع السكيلابيلتي بتاعه المدارس دي، وده لازم يبقى بارتنرشيبس ما بين القطاع العام والقطاع الخاص والان جي اوز طبعا لاستمراريه هذه العماله، لانه الميزه كمان انه العماله دي تقريبا بتبقى زيرو unemployment بعد ما تتخرج. الناشونال كواليفيكيشن فريم ورك ده مهم قوي اعتماده، لانه المطلوب مش بس ان العامل يقول انا شايف نفسي اوفر كواليفيكيشن ولا اندر كواليفيكيشن، لكن ده معتمد في ديسكريبتيفز لكل وظيفه. وبالتالي لما العامل يتقدم لوظيفه معينه، مش بس هو برسبشن عشان هو معاه دبلوم واللي جنبه شايف ان هو خريج مثلا ابتدائيه وشايف ان هو اوفر كواليفيكيشن عشان هما بيأدوا نفس الوظيفه، فدي هو اوفر كواليفيكيشن. لا، اوفر كواليفيكيشن اللي يحكمها المهارات اللي حضرتك حصلت عليها لما خرجت من مدرسه التعليم الفني، اللي انت يجوز ان انت ما دخلتهاش اصلا وحصلت على الشهاده في اخر الامتحانات. فده بالتالي انه الجاب اللي ما بين المؤهلات اللي حضرتك حاصل عليها كعامل وما بين الديسكريبتيفز للكواليفيكيشن اللي مطلوبه للوظيفه، هو ده اللي هيحدد حضرتك كنت اوفر كواليفيكيشن ولا اندر كواليفيكيشن. وده لسه لحد النهارده ما تمش اعتماده، وطبعا ده يعني من الافضل ان يتم اعتماد الناشونال كواليفيكيشن فريم ورك للعماله المصريه. النقطه اللي بعد كده الخاصه بالجوب كواليتي، انا يعني الواضح قوي في الدراسه انه الجوب كواليتي مرتبطه بالirregularity وبالبريكاريوس ورك والانفورماليتي، وبالتالي انه زي ما حضرتك دكتور راجي اشرت انه يعني كانت 19% في 2011، هي دلوقتي في 18 ل 23 18%، يعني مش الانخفاض الكبير في الفتره دي. وده يعني الريت اوف بريكاريوس ورك بوزيتيفلي اسوسييتد وذ ريت اوف بافرتي، وده طبعا بيهايلايت حته النمو الاحتوائي ولا النمو الداعم للوظائف الاحتوائيه. وبالتالي احنا هنا مش بنتكلم على بس مور جنريتنج جوبس، ولكن جنريتنج بيتر جوبس او كواليتي اوف ذيز جوبس. ده بيأكد الدراسة بتاعة لايل أول about البريكاريوسنس في 2019 اللي بتتكلم على ان الامبروفينج في الانemployment ريت rates are not synonymous with unimproving في الليبر ماركت. وده بيقول انه بالرغم ان حصل تحسن في الانemployment ريت، الا ان الثلث العماله المصريه لازالت بريكاريوس. كمان الانفورماليتي وركرز اولسو يعني كانت بوم مع الكونستراكشن سيكتور. ده عمل ايه مهم قوي النقطه دي، ان ده عمل فورس للومن ان هي تخرج من سوق العمل، وخاصه الميدل كلاس وومن والاديوكيتد وومن. خرجوا من سوق العمل، وبالتالي الامبلويمنت ريت قل، الانemployment ريت كمان قل. ده بيتماشى مع الدراسه اللي هو discouragement للومن. الستاتس بتاع بتاع الومن الانفورماليتي والirregularity زايده عن المن، وده في ظل انخفاض القطاع الحكومي في توظيف العمالة وخاصة النساء، فالمعدل البطالة للنساء جيفن العرض العمالة من المستمر من النساء هي متوقع انه المفروض يزيد الا لو القطاع الخاص ابسورب هذه العمالة. والقطاع الخاص دايما بسمعها من المصنعين ان هو شايف انه توظيف الاناث ما هو الا بردن عليه، فهو مش حابب انه يوظف الاناث. فاذا كان هذا القطاع هو الباب الاساسي لامتصاص هذه العمالة الزائدة، لازم يبقى أسوة بالحوافز المفروض تتقدم للقطاع الخاص، سواء حوافز قطاعية أو الحوافز الخاصة بالهيكل الجغرافي، يبقى يضاف إليها حوافز خاصة بهيكل النوع. يعني لو وظفت نسبة كذا من الستات هيتم مثلا بالسياسة المالية مثلا أو السياسة النقدية، سواء السماح الضريبي أو معدلات الفايدة المنخفضة. شكرا لحضراتكم ونشتغل.
شكرا دكتور.
Thank you very much. There's a lot of food for thought from both commentators, and Dr. Shaimaa should have presented a paper by herself in this case. Give a lot of more meaning to the statistic that has been presented in the labor survey. Let me take 2 questions from the floor and 2 questions from the online, in order to give the author in the end. And I know maybe Carolina is about to go to sleep right now, so we want her to still be awake. If there is any question from the floor, we'll take only 2. Please, go ahead.
Thank you for inviting me to attend this important session. I was interested in some of the results, especially related to the population of the demographic dimension, which is actually concerning fertility. The national strategy for population and development that was announced in 2023 aimed at achieving replacement level, which is 2.1 by actually 2030. But according to the results obtained from this panel survey, we should congratulate Egypt, because actually it will be possible to reach that target maybe next year in 2024 or 2025. So actually we are advanced in that respect. That is a positive result if it is true. However, going back to this, I think we need to reconsider that estimates, because according to CAPMA's estimates for the 2023, the estimated total fertility rate was about 2.54. So actually, there is a difference between what we reached from that study and what we reached from CAPMA's. And the estimates obtained from CAPMA's is not using one approach. It was actually reached through adapting different approaches, whether methodologically or actually the direct approach. It's dependent on the actual number of births, the distribution of births by age of mother and place of residence, and the age structure obtained from CAPMA's. So actually, we will be interested in knowing, based on the 2.2 total fertility rate, what is the expected number of births for the year 2023. And I think the problem is related to the age structure that was obtained from the survey. We need to rediscuss and to evaluate that point, because it would be very important to the policy of Egypt. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I see online Dr. Layla Al-Khawaja raise her hand. Dr. Layla Al-Khawaja online. Dr. Layla, do you want to ask your question?
Yes, please. أنا سؤالي للدكتور راجي على structure of employment by sectors. إزاي انخفض أعداد العاملين في قطاع الكونستراكشن رغم إنه 22 و 23 شهدوا استثمارات عامة كبيرة جدا في المدن الذكية والمدن الجديدة والطرق والكباري والأنفاق. وده مش تشغيل حكومي، لأنهم بيعملوا اوت سورسنج لشركات من القطاع الخاص هي اللي بتنفذ الحاجات دي. السؤال الثاني، الانخفاض في الانفورمال سيكتور حتى لو طفيف جه لمصلحة أنهي سيكتور؟ يعني اشتغلوا في الفورمال برايفت سيكتور ولا اشتغلوا في السيلف امبلويد؟ شكرا يا دكتور حسن.
شكرا دكتورة ليلى. في سؤال تاني from the floor. Go ahead.
Do you hear me? Yes.
Yes.
My name is Pasqualino Mare. I'm from the European Training Foundation. We are a European Union agency. Now, my question is very simple. The employment rate in the public sector is declining. As you know, in Egypt, there is an ongoing reform in the technical education sector, an important reform, in which there is also attention for the gender gap, of course. I wonder what, with the outcomes that were presented here, demonstrating that there is a decline in the public expenditure, to which extent this important conclusions that were drawn today can influence also a change in hiring more teachers, for example, because in the education sector, there is a decline of teachers due to retirement and recruitment stop, but there is an increase of enrollment in the technical education sector. So it is a contradiction and it is a problem. So to which extent the outcomes of this important research can influence policies, in particular to this sector? Thank you.
Thank you. Last question, Dr. Ali Abbas.
شكرا جزيلا. محمد عباس، مدير عام الجهاز المركزي الإحصائي في السودان. حقيقة أنا سعيد جدا أكون وسطكم في هذا الملتقى، وللدعوة التي قدمت من جهاز المركزي للتعبئة العامة والإحصاء، وأيضا لمنتدى البحوث الاقتصادية لحضور هذا الملتقى لإعلان نتائج المسح التتبعي لسوق العمل في جولته الخامسة. وده طبعا إنجاز كبير جدا كونه جمهورية مصر تصل للجولة الخامسة في هذا المسح، وهذا يمثل خبرة متراكمة من حيث الكوادر الوطنية، وأيضا قاعدة معلوماتية متسلسلة لفترات متعاقبة، وتطور كبير من حيث المنهجية مبني على العلم والممارسة. السودان نفذ الجولة الأولى في نهاية العام 2022 أيضا بشراكة مع منتدى البحوث الاقتصادية، وتم نشر البيانات والنتائج الأولية فقط، وللظروف الحاصلة الآن في السودان لم يتم عملية التحليل المعمق للاستفادة من هذا المسح. وتمت الاستفادة من خبرات مصرية في تنفيذ هذا المسح في السودان من بروفيسور راجي أزعد وأستاذ عبد الوهاب ودكتورة داليا والأستاذ سامح، وحتما حنستفيد من كل الخبرات المتراكمة لمصر في هذا المجال لتنفيذ هذا المسح في جولاته القادمة، ونتمنى إن شاء الله أن الوضع في السودان يتحسن ونجري. طيب. End of my talking, I have a question. Apply for all survey finding, not what have been presented only. يعني. To what extent do ERF and CABMAS translate these data and findings of the survey into policy indicators and bridge the gap between research and policy making so as all the data and statistics from these surveys and other survey inform policy and decision making. Thank you very much for you.
Thank you very much. Okay, go ahead, Mona. Dr. Mona Saeed.
The message about what's happening to employment growth between the two papers, because Caroline had a chart that showed that the employment rate, which I think is the employment to population ratio, and the work rate have both declined quite substantially for both men and women. So for example, for women, it went from 22 to 15, and for men, 70-something to 60-something. So on the other hand, the main story from Ragi's presentation is that there are, substantial improvements on the employment front. But is it more the structure and the quality of employment? I mean, do we think that although the quantity of employment, the number of people employed have declined, but really, the people who remained employed or the new people who are employed are getting better jobs? I was just wondering if this is the story. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we're going to give the author the chance to respond to some of these questions. Carolina and Ragi, you have 3 minutes each. We are really over time. And I know you want to finish with this, Caroline. Go ahead.
I can start off. Thank you, everyone, for these excellent comments. And I really appreciate the comments of the discussants, which highlighted some really important issues on both the supply and demand sides. I'll try to tackle specifically some of the questions from the floor and online. So in terms of the demographic trends, we definitely have tried to validate certainly the trend in declining fertility, and the CAPMAS numbers agree with there being a decline. The level is, of course, an estimate with different methods. And one thing to note is, as Ragi highlighted, the age structure we see is very similar with the labor force surveys and other surveys. So that helps validate the age structure, but it remains very much an open question, I think, what is going to happen over time and in the future. Will fertility rates continue to decline, or is there going to be more of a stall and a return to higher rates because perhaps some births were delayed and there'll be some catch up? So I think that's an important one to keep monitoring and to keep estimating. I think another important question raised related to employment rates versus employment quality, and Ragi can speak to this as well, but I think there's an important distinction to be made between the employment rate, which is indeed the employment to population ratio, versus the quality of the jobs that exist. And self-employment for particular is growing, but are those necessarily productive jobs, or are they more survival self-employment? So I think that's one to kind of keep in mind in terms of some of the trends. And I think to the question on translating the data and findings into policy indicators and bridging that, we certainly will see, I think, over the discussions today, how you can use the Egypt Labor Market Panel survey data to capture key trends like fertility, but also for estimating the impact of policies and programs. So we'll be talking about things like unpaid care work and what some policies and programs might be to affect that later in the day. So apologies if I didn't get to any other comments, but I'll stop here.
I'm going to be very brief because I know you all want to get to the coffee break. First, I want to thank both our discussants for very excellent comments, but I don't have any specific response to any of the issues the discussants raised. I'd like to respond to Dr. Laya Khawaja, who talked about the continued investment, public investment in construction and infrastructure, and how does that correspond to the decline in the construction sector share of employment. And I think that a lot of the construction employment is actually in private housing. And so what's happening in the public sector investment side, especially with these very highly capital-intensive projects, is not necessarily an indicator of what's happening to the construction sector as a whole. The data seem to indicate that construction sector employment has slowed significantly, and in fact, there's a shift of employment to other sectors of the economy, despite the continued public investment in that direction. Now, again, whether the reduction in informal employment overall is to the benefit of the private sector wage employment or to self-employment, the answer is both. We see a slight shift towards formality in the private sector, but I think the overall wage employment in the private sector has not grown. In fact, has shrunk very slightly. So that growth of self-employment is a big part of the story. As far as the representative from the European Training Foundation and their question about investment in public education, I completely agree that not just education, but the entire care economy, education, social care, health, is a major need for public sector investment. And in fact, I think that public sector contraction of employment has gone too far, especially in not hiring enough in these social economy sectors. So I think that the decline of employment in education is very clear, and there is a switch towards privatization in education as we see in the increase in self-employment in education. So that the public sector is not investing enough. Parents and families are moving towards a private market for education, and I think that trend needs to be reversed. So hiring more teachers and hiring more health workers and more care economy workers, I think, is important. In Dr. Mona Saeed's question about the contradiction between dropping employment to population ratios, despite that, first of all, there's a slowdown in the decrease of employment to population ratios, and employment growth has accelerated. It doesn't mean that it's growing faster than population. It's just that it has, relative to the previous period, it has accelerated somewhat. So there is a somewhat positive tendency. So the number of people employed has not declined. It is the relative to population that it has not been keeping up with that. And of course, to Mr. Ali Abbas's question about translating the research into policy, I think that's everybody's job, not just ERF's job. ERF is providing the data infrastructure, the evidence base, and it's all our jobs to use that data infrastructure to produce good policy recommendations, good strategies, and in fact, the ILO and the other development markers are going to help in doing that. And this takes quite a few years and time to do that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you again, everybody. And just adding one note to my brother from the Sudanese, I think what we are seeing here right now is the first step, because we do invite all the concerned parties. So we have the government, CABMAS has the link, the Ministry of Planning has the link, all of the government agency. In addition, I think it's more important, the World Bank, the UN organization, the ILO, all of these are taking these into consideration whenever they inform the government. So sometimes the government will get our feedback through the international partner in this case. Thank you very much. We have 15 minutes coffee break. We're going to convene at 1 o'clock in order to resume our third panel. Thank you very much.